Welcome back to the Popperian Podcast, the podcast where we look into the life and the work of the philosopher Karl Popper. And today we're going to make a slight diversion, though we are going to talk about truth. Today's guest is a fairly remarkable guest and someone who I've been reading almost all of my adult life, or at least the portion of adult life where I was focused on academic work. This is the writer, the former leader of the Canadian Liberal Party, former rector and president of Central European University. He's now stood down as to his former role as a professor of history at the same university. This is Michael Ignatieff. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Jed.
So I really have been reading your work my entire life. I've been reading way back to my undergraduate days, bumped into your work, and of course on things like human rights and civil war and humanitarian intervention. So why now? Why Consolation? So I've been talking about your new book called On Consolation, which I'll link below. So why now take this turn and write so deeply and so interestingly about consolation?
I think it is a little change because as you say, I've written about human rights and international politics and stuff. It may be a function of getting a little older. I'm one of the good things about life is you get older and you begin to see the world in a different way as you age. Consolation is something I think you turn to when you get a little older. I think it's that. It's also a jump backwards for me because in the 1980s, I wrote a book called The Needs of Strangers. And so this is a return to what I was doing then, which was the history of ideas. And the form I took in the 1980s was to do these essays about people facing dilemmas in a historical context and trying to think their way out of it. And the Consolation book takes that form too. One of my convictions is that we make it very difficult for students to understand why texts emerge at all because we never situate them in the lives that produce them. You know, we talk about Locke or Smith or Popper, for that matter, without thinking deeply enough about the situation in their life that gave them rise. So this is a book about great works of consolation, but set in the context of the lives that produce them. So, to give you an example, I have a chapter on Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. This is a book that people have been reading for a couple of thousand years, and I've read it as an undergraduate. But it wasn't until I realized that he wrote it in a place called Vindobana, which happens to be quite close to Vienna, where I'm talking to you from. And why is he in Vienna? Why is the emperor of all the Romans in Vienna? Well, because he's fighting a counterinsurgency war against the barbarians. The minute you understand that, you understand the context in which this guy is working. He's writing late at night in the middle of an absolutely god-awful war of slaughter, burning villages, suppressing this barbarian incursion which threatens his empire. And I read him as a man at the end of his tether, and I think this gives a sharpness and poignancy to the Meditations. He is essentially seeking to console himself that I think is missing unless you see that context. So that's the kind of methodology that I've employed, and it, as it were, takes me back to where I started, really, which is I'm a historian of ideas.
Well, let's talk about Marcus Aurelius then. I thought it was quite an interesting part, and we can begin to touch on truth and how these matter. And you write about Marcus Aurelius that, and this is a quote, he knew he was not loved. He knew that his generals mocked him behind his back. This was a man who saw all around him the fame and the trappings of fame and the idea of being remembered. And you write that he secured immortality thanks not to any monuments or bridges or great deeds, but this secret activity that he did late at night that kept him awake. And I had this thought of yourself after your life in politics. You wrote this wonderful book called Fire and Ashes. And you wrote this thing, you said in that book, something along the lines of, It's important that our leaders stay awake, troubled at night with deep moral questions. And you write about Marcus Aurelius that he's alone at night and he can't get through the night. He's stuck with his own thoughts. So did that chapter resonate in any way with you in that way?
Well, it's nice of you to put it that way, and I think you're the first person ever to do so. And I'm not actually sure whether you're right, because there seems something ludicrously presumptuous about me identifying myself with, Marcus Aurelius, who will be remembered long after I'm, dead and gone, forgotten. I mean, it's an interesting thing about Marcus Aurelius. If you look on Amazon philosophy, Marcus Aurelius has been outselling everybody for a couple thousand years, and he's going to be right up there. And boy, I'd like to have his royalties. I'm being slightly trivial here, but it's a way of expressing respect for this guy. I look, what I do think is true, Jed, is that I identified very strongly with his situation. I could easily imagine what it's like to be, in a position of power and influence, struggling to hold things together. Because I think the thing that unlocked the consolations for me is to ask yourself, to whom could an emperor seek consolation from? Answer, nobody, because you can't trust anybody. You can't confide in anybody. You can only confide in yourself. And this is, I think, what produces the meditations. He sits there late at night. He writes them in Greek, by the way, so that, the local slaves and serfs and centurions guarding him are unlikely to be reading Greek. It's a kind of inner personal confession. And I think once you understand that, you begin to see what he's trying to do, which is just talk to himself, because he can't talk to anybody else about getting older, being frightened, not being sure he's up to it. I mean, by which I mean, this is an emperor who wasn't really raised to run a counterinsurgency war. He's an intellectual, basically, and he finds himself thrust into a situation where he must have asked himself, can I do this? And some of this, I think, leaks through into the meditations. They're commonly read by all teachers of the history of philosophy as, a great text in Stoicism. It's certainly that. But I think it's much more interesting when it's filtered through these autobiographical considerations.
Let's talk about Stoicism then. And you have a chapter, I believe it's just before your chapter on Marcus Aurelius, about Cicero and the death of his daughter. And of course, this is this philosopher, and very well-known philosopher, who spent his life speaking and lecturing and writing about the importance of mastering one's emotions. And yet when his daughter dies, he is a complete wreck and he's completely lost. And you write somewhere in the book that he suddenly realizes that all those words suddenly mean absolutely nothing at that moment.
I think that's an important thing about Cicero. This is the Cicero I admire, the Cicero who discovers that all his confident speeches fall away when he suffers an intimate personal loss, the loss of this daughter. This is the Cicero that I'm sympathetic to, not the kind of, arrogant, proud, ambitious, cunning, deceitful, political man, but the man who faces an intimate loss. And it raises an issue that, Jed, is central to the book, which is consolation is something we do with ourselves and with others that is at the very limit of what words can do. Words fail us commonly when we either console ourselves or when we seek to console someone else. And so I'm especially interested in moments when words fail. I hope the book is a vindication of words ultimately, because these words, twisted out of anguish and pain, have consoled people for millennia. But part of what makes the words that Cicero crafts for his own grief so moving and effective is that they are crafted from feeling a kind of despair, that no words are possible to encompass the grief of losing his own daughter. And I think that's one of the central issues about consolation. It is both at the limit of what words can do, and when you can get to that limit and somehow find words to express your feelings, it can have an incredibly powerful consoling effect on yourself and on others.
What do we gain from discovering that limit? There's a point, I believe I have it before me. By the way, this is an incredibly emotional book. I'm not the kind of person that tends to get emotional reading, but I was quite emotional at times reading this book. And you write, I'm visiting a friend who lost his wife 6 months ago. He is frail but unsparingly alert. The chair where she used to sit, still in its place across from his. The room remains as she arranged it. I bought him a cake from a cafe that they used to visit together when they were courting. He eats a slice. When I ask him how things are going, he looks out the window and says quietly, if only I could believe that I could see her again. There is nothing I can say, so we sit in silence. I came to console, or at least to comfort, but I can do neither. To understand consolation is to necessarily begin in the moments when it is impossible. And that was incredibly moving. And of course, my question is, why do we need to start there? Why is it so important to start in that moment where you suddenly realize that you can get nowhere with consolation, words, deeds, or anything?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why I think that so strongly. I think some of it has to do with this issue of truth. I think consolation is our encounter with the most painful things that happen to us. And in the face of pain and failure and grief, we commonly take refuge in illusion. I mean, I certainly have. Life is difficult. You tell yourself little stories to get yourself by. But then there are moments when the truth hits you, that the full force of what you have lost or what you've failed at hits you, and you are momentarily reduced to silence. And so consolation is at the frontier of the inconsolable. And I certainly learned that with this old friend of mine who had, we had a good and had a wonderful friendship. And it was a friendship that included his wife, who was a fantastic woman. And she died very suddenly after 50 years of marriage. And it was just obvious there was nothing you could say to this guy. There was just nothing you could say, because anything you say would be falsified. He'd simply say, I know you mean well, Michael, but frankly, nothing you're saying is reaching me. I'm just in a pit here that I can't get out of. And so consolation is at the edge of the inconsolable, but it's also an important subject because it's at the limit of human solidarity. It's the place where we need to show solidarity the most because people need us to be there. But, pain is a kind of prison and you can't get into it and you can't share it with someone else. And so that's why it's and I just think you can't write honestly about consolation unless you face up to that reality. The book has been criticized by some people because it connects consolation to hope. It says what it is to console someone or to console yourself is to find enough meaning in what you've suffered so that you can kind of go on. You can sustain hope. And some people have criticized that because they think, there are just some situations for which hope is not possible. And I accept that. Consolation is a struggle to find hope in the face of loss and suffering and death, but it's extremely difficult. And it, as I say, takes us to the limit of what words can do and say. So
talking about those limits and truth and the idea that there's a social element to all of this. You begin your book with what many people would consider to be a completely inconsolable story, and that's the story of Job. I know you've said that you're not religious. I'm not religious, but I've never appreciated the story of Job before I read it in your own words. And I began to appreciate the character of Job in so many ways. This is a man who is refusing to admit guilt in any way, refusing to admit that there's purpose here, refusing to admit false comfort. He is demanding to be heard. He's demanding that people see the truth of what he has suffered there. So why start with Job in this way? And why is truth such an important thing for Job in this story?
Yeah, I think you've understood why I started with Job. A lot of people find it a bit tough because Job is a horrible story. I mean, let's remember what this is. This is a devout believer who suddenly finds himself faced with a God who decides to test his faith by basically torturing Job. He destroys Job's family. He inflicts a plague on Job, and Job is entirely innocent. It's one of those horrible stories of divine power in any language, in any literature. And what I hold on to in Job is this defiant insistence, that he won't take false consolation from anybody who tells him you brought this on yourself. These are Job's false comforters. And he continues to insist, even to the limits of getting up on his feet while he's in rags covered in sores and basically shouting at God, "Why are you doing this to me?" And so the reason I put him at the beginning of the book is that that's what we do when we seek consolation. Why is this happening? How do I give meaning to what I'm going through? And Job is the great symbol of that. He kind of shakes his fist at the sky, and then astoundingly, God replies out of the whirlwind. And what I find moving about this is that the story is telling you that there is a meaning, there is a cosmic meaning to suffering and loss. You may not be able to find it, but you're not in a meaningless world. That's why God's reply is as important as Job's. Job insists that there is a meaning. God says there is, but it may be above your capacity to understand. And that's often where we are in the situation with consolation. We suffer some terrible loss and can't give any meaning to it. But the parable is telling us, keep searching, keep struggling, keep finding some way to give this a meaning, with the condition, Jed, which is also what Job is also saying, with the condition that it be true. And that's why I think the Job story properly begins the Western tradition of the search for consolation.
Can we reason ourselves towards consolation in any way? At this point, I'm thinking about your chapter on Boethius, so the empire. So Rome has fallen, the barbarians have taken over, and the aristocracy are, in some ways, they've lost their pride. They're being belittled, and Boethius is this really interesting character, one who at some point in the stories stands up for this plot and stands up for the Roman senators, and he leaps to the defense in public against the king, and he says, if you're accusing them, you're accusing me. And then he looks around himself, and everyone is in silence and no one is backing him up, and he's sent to death. And importantly, in the story, there's this way where he's trying to reason himself into consolation, and yet every time he reasons himself to consolation, it works for a moment. And then as soon as he stops reasoning, it all disappears, and the flood of anger and emotion and betrayal comes flooding back to him.
Yeah, I think you've I think you've got the kernel of the Boethius story. It is, again, rather like Marcus Aurelius, rather like Job. It's been used for millennia to help understand the dilemma of consolation. And what I find so fantastic about Boethius is that in real life, this man was facing imminent execution at the hands of a barbarian king. What does he do? He invents a character. He invents this wonderful character called Lady Philosophia, who comes down to him in the narrative to comfort him and console him and rid him of the fear that he faces as he awaits execution. And so the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius is much more interesting than simply a philosophical guide to being consoled. It's a psychological struggle between the emotions, as you say, of anger and fear and horror, battling the rational mind incarnated by Lady Philosophia. And that's what makes it such a moving book. That's what makes it a book that people have read for 2,000 years. It's not some kind of breviary of confident philosophical claptrap. It's a dynamic depiction of the inner struggle when you're scared to death. And that's why I think people have read it for millennia and will continue to read it because of its psychic truth. Because of its understanding, in fact, that when we seek to console ourselves, we are constantly struggling between rational propositions, which we can develop by our minds, and the undertow of psychic emotion that so often seems to drag us down.
There is another undertow as well dragging us down in this battle. And you write about this here. And again, you wrote about this first, I believe, in your book, Fire and Ashes. And that is what Machiavelli termed fortuna. And I remember after your life in politics, you saying you suddenly understood what fortuna was all about and what Machiavelli was on about here. And Boethius finds comfort in the Greeks and in Plato. And he says the Greeks taught him to think of himself as a victim of pitiless fate, bound and tied to fortune's turning wheel. So I might get you to take us there for a moment, this idea that fortune is going to come your way and change and destroy your best laid plans. And it is always, there's always going to be something out there beyond what we can control and reason ourselves to.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of great philosophers, Bernard Williams and others, have talked about fate and luck. What is so hard to accept in life and to seek, and what we seek consolation for is when we're faced with a run of bad luck. In other words, when we're faced with an experience of adverse fortune. And what's so painful is that it doesn't seem to depend on anything we did, where we feel that we're kind of helpless pawns of a set of circumstances that we thought we could control, but we can't control at all. And that's something that Boethius captures so well. He had rode the wheel of fortune up until he became the most senior advisor to the barbarian king. And now the wheel of fortune has thrown him down to the bottom and he's awaiting execution. And this is a common experience of life. Our narrative is that we control our lives, that we are the authors of our lives. And so modern people, I think, have banished the idea of fate. But that's why Machiavelli and Boethius and these ancient philosophers are so wise. They understand that there's an enormous amount that happens to us over which we have absolutely no control at all. And so we have to learn to console ourselves and understand the limited purchase we have on the making of our own life, the radical amount of contingency in it, the radical amount of luck in it, the radical amount of just pure misfortune. And then, of course, the portion of it that is properly our responsibility, the portion of it that is on us, as it were. And figuring all that out is what a human life is all about.
So from the mind there and into the body and to Montaigne in his tower. And this is a book I remember reading a long time ago, reading the work of Montaigne and not fully appreciating it. I think I was a little too young for it. And this is something that I'm not sure how you feel about this, but this is something that when people go through incredible difficulty in their lives and they search for consolation, they often say that this helps. And Montaigne is telling us to turn back to our bodies and don't do the work of philosophy and pick us apart into small pieces of something he wrote. And you put out a few quotes here, and one of them is he is sitting there taking huge pleasure in scratching itches and feeling the flows of his own body. So how important is it to get out of our own heads in some way and pay attention to the physical body?
Yeah, one of the things that makes Montaigne's late essays, these are essays he wrote towards the very end of his life in the late 1580s, is that this was one of the most learned men of his time. He had one of the greatest libraries of his time. He is a master of the philosophical tradition, going back to Socrates. And yet what's so interesting at the end of his life is that he somehow turns away from his books. He begins to notice that when he is low, when he's melancholy, when he's depressed, it's not to the books that he turns, but increasingly to just connecting to the flow of life itself. He's a person who loves riding on horseback, for example, and he rides on horseback even though it's killing him because he's got terrible problems with kidney stones. He loves riding. He loves a well-made bed. He obviously likes a well-turned glass of wine. And what he's saying is quite profound here, which is that there are a lot of situations that we can't think ourselves out of. Philosophy is, philosophy can't help us through these situations. But life itself, the routines, the common, humble pleasures of life are tremendously important. If you can't think yourself out of a problem, he's saying, why don't you just surrender to life for a while? Go for a walk, get on a horse, go out to dinner with a pretty lady or a handsome man or whoever you fancy. I mean, that there's a lot about life that is much more powerful than we understand. It has a kind of wave capacity to pull us out of the deep water and put us safely on the shore. And that's, I think, a tremendously wise aspect of Montaigne. In fact, to teach us a certain suspicion of our rational faculties, a certain sardonic, ironic relation to philosophical wisdom. And that's very unexpected because he was, in many ways, the wisest philosophical mind of his time.
And he wrote that by turning inward in this way, he had to deal with the fact and struggle against the fact that he may be deluding himself in some way, which brings us back to truth. And he writes this question, and I might pose the question back to you. So all that idea of getting in touch with the body, you say here that in an essay, I think it's called On Diversion, he asked himself a question, whether all this consolation was simply distraction. And so I might turn Montaigne's question to you. Does distraction have any role in consolation, do you think?
I don't think there's any doubt that it does. And I think we shouldn't condescend to distraction for the simple reason that some of the things that happen to us are simply too powerful for us, too overwhelming for us. He has a wonderful story, Montaigne does, of consoling a woman who was grieving the death of her husband. And he thought to himself, I could give her, Seneca, or I could give her Cicero. I could, read to her some worthy passages from the great Stoic philosophers. And they thought, this is ridiculous. What I should be doing is just sitting with her and talking to her about her family, about her kids, trying to distract her somehow. And I think there's something very humane about that moment. He understands that he can't really console her because she's suffered a mortal blow. But that what humanly he can do is just sit with her and kind of chatter at her and tell her a funny story and get her to laugh through her tears and not go back into the pit of grief. But there's something else going on here, I think, Jed, which is that consolation is both a conscious process to which I think philosophy can have access, but it's also a deeply unconscious process. Anybody who's lost a loved one knows that you can just be flattened by grief, and it can take you years in a way to get over it. And so in that long period of grief, I think diversion is essential to allow the inner psychic processes, the unconscious processes, to begin to do their work of healing. And thank God those processes work beneath the rational and philosophical mind, because they have to do their work and they take their own sweet time. And they're one of the things that keeps us standing up through difficult times.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. So to drill in on truth a little bit more here, there's a chapter where you speak about, I'm going to mispronounce this, is Condorcet during the terror in France, and he has to flee. He hides in a house with a very kind woman who shelters him at her own risk. And he begins to lose consolation. He begins to lose all hope because they are coming and they're going to kill him if they do find him. And he eventually finds hope in a very Popperian place, and a very interesting place, and that is with progress and truth. And he talks about how you say in the book, Robespierre justified the terror against the revolution and, of course, his enemies by claiming that history would slip back into inequality and tyranny. And Condorcet turns this around and says, no, the human species is on an upward projection. We are moving forward. We're making progress, forever renewing ourselves. And he looks at the printing press and the world around him and says, things like this make progress almost irreversible. So what comfort should we take from progress?
Well, I think this is a very important theme. If, as religion loses its force and persuasiveness for lots of people, what story about time do we tell ourselves? The Christian story about time is that time would end with the resurrection and the last trump, and that story of time guided human understanding of time in the Christian world for millennia. And there was this idea of a providence that guided time, that made sense of time, that gave it a shape and a direction. As that wanes, people like Condorcet begin to develop an alternative account of providence that is secularized, that a purely secular account of progress based of time based on progress, based on the progress of the human mind, based on the progress of science. Condorcet was a famous mathematician, and he felt, living through the Enlightenment, that knowledge, education was breaking the bounds of superstition. As it breaks the bounds of superstition, it makes people more free. They get impatient with tyranny and authoritarianism. They get impatient with the superstitions of religion. They contribute their knowledge to the economy, and the economy begins to take off. The printing press and other technologies make possible the diffusion of free opinions. That then further turbocharges economic development. And so you have a story of progress, and there is no limit to what that progress can do. I mean, Condorcet is sitting in confinement in a miserable upstairs room in the winter of 1794 in Paris, while people are waiting to arrest him and take him to the guillotine. And he's imagining a future in which science conquers illness, our life expectancy grows. He's imagining a world in which science is driving public policy in a way that makes life fairer and more equitable and for everyone. He's trying to imagine a future that in many ways has happened. This idea of progress is probably the most important source of collective public consolation that is left. I mean, if you look at what's got us through COVID, is the gut belief, the hope, and the feeling that science will get us out of this. And there's good evidence that the vaccination discoveries that we put in place and spread around the world are going to beat back the variants that are on the horizon. And so behind COVID is this hope that progress will get us out and take us to a better place. A lot of this originates with people like Condorcet. The problem with progress as consolation is, pretty obvious, which is that Condorcet develops this idea of progress while he's awaiting his own death. And he does meet his own death at the hands of the Jacobin revolutionaries in 1794. So there's a deep irony. He's the person who generates the most hopeful vision of the human future, and he's actually killed by the revolutionaries that he used to be part of. That's one irony, but the other irony, much more painful and much more obvious to anybody listening to this, is, hope and faith in progress is not much consolation if you've lost your mom, your dad, your sister, your brother. That is a collective story that there is hope for the human race because science will take us out of plagues like this, is not much comfort or consolation to those who have lost their loved ones. So there's always a discordance between these collective myths of consolation like progress and the actual human experience of individuals.
Well, let's stay focusing on that discordance between the individual and often the needs and the hopes of the individual as opposed to what is needed in the larger spectrum. And let's talk about Abraham Lincoln and, of course, the Civil War and the horrors that he spent each day experiencing. And reading this particular chapter, I had memories going back to a very early book of yours called The Warrior's Honor. We talk about civil conflict and how it emerges so suddenly. And there's this moment in Lincoln's life and the life of anyone in a situation like this, where you desperately need those around you to find consolation, forgiveness, reconciliation. And it is so hard to pull together. It's so hard to forgive the other side. And in some ways you have to do the nearly impossible thing, which is stare at that enemy which you hate so much and say something along the lines of, I understand that you are victims too in all of this. It's such a horrible, difficult place And of course, with politics behind you, you may have some interesting insight here as well. So please take us there.
Well, Lincoln is I think the greatest hero of democratic politics that there is, and the wisest and the most profoundly human of all our great democratic leaders. And partly, I think, because he has such a deep biblical sense of the drama that overcame his country in the Civil War. And what he, I think, understands is that his job as a practical politician at the end of the Civil War is to find a way for two peoples who have fought each other to the death, and 800,000 people have died, to get these two peoples to understand that each of them thought God was on their side. And the job of a politician is to say to them, and he does in the sublime second inaugural that he gives in March 1865, his message is, let's recover our humility. Let's recover an understanding that human beings don't get to know whether God is on their side. The ferocity of conviction that led to the war was based on the assumption that people could know which side was ultimately just. And Lincoln is saying, we don't get to know this. This is above the human capacity to understand. Politics has to be conducted, he's saying, in ignorance of the ultimate direction of history or the ultimate meaning of our experience. We can only deal with what we know. And what we know, Lincoln says, is we fought a war that has ended with the victory of one side, but we cannot assume that that is God's will, that one side has won. We have to instead devote ourselves to the duties that we can clearly see, which is to bind up the nation's wounds and comfort the widow and the orphan, because there are widows and orphans on both sides. And the thing we do share, and it's unequivocally clear, is we have both suffered and we have both died and we have both lost people. And this is a really sublimely wise attempt by a great politician to heal the most brutal wounds that can ever divide a republic. The tragedy, of course, is that within 3 weeks of giving that speech, he is assassinated precisely by someone who wants to refuse that message of humility and comfort and consolation. And so it's one of the most tragic speeches in the democratic lexicon and one of the greatest. And I think it's an example to every politician that in the face of conflict, a politician's true job is to heal, is to comfort, is to console, for the simple reason that, a politician's job is to keep the show on the road, to keep democratic life together. And Lincoln understood that instinctively, and many politicians in the 20th and 21st century have not, which is why he's in the book.
Let's talk about Max Weber. And my instinct is here, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that you probably personally find some of the similar consolations that Max Weber found as well. So this is about work and the Protestant work ethic. And I remember years ago, you write in somewhere and you used this phrase, I think it was a little tongue in cheek, but you used a phrase to describe yourself. And you said, men who need to be kept busy. Men who need to be kept busy, I believe was the phrase you used to describe yourself. So do you personally find consolation in work? And if it is to be found, what is it that about work that gives us consolation?
Well, Weber is, I think, the 20th century figure who thinks most deeply and with most impact on what it is to live beyond the certainties of religious faith. And one of the key elements of religious faith was the idea which you see in Luther, that if you chose a certain kind of profession, a certain kind of work, you could have a sense that would suffuse your whole being that your work was pleasing to the Lord, and that the Lord would reward you with eternal life. And what Weber sees so clearly is that certainty, that sense that your work is your vocation, is your calling, and is pleasing to the Lord, that's gone. And that's, I think, what makes him such a great analyst of the dilemmas and uncertainties of being alive in the 20th and 21st centuries. I mean, for me, I've never had a sense that my vocation or my calling was pleasing to the Lord. That's a consolation that just isn't available. But there's no question for millions of people. I mean, not just me, but for most people, I hope for you too, Jed, this sense that the enormous pleasure, engagement, concentration that you get from sticking at a piece of work, the satisfaction you get from doing it well, the recognition that you get when others say you've done well, is, I think, at the core of our morale, of our sense of what life is for. Work gives meaning to everything, I think. The thing that Weber sees, however, is that if you don't believe, if you don't have a faith in God, you will never have that sense of ultimate vindication, that you are doing what you must do. Some people do have that, it must be said. That is, they feel, and it's one of the great feelings in life, when you're doing something, you feel, I am made to be doing this. This is what I was put here to do. That's a fantastic feeling. I felt it occasionally in my life, and I hope that people listening to this program will feel that a lot in their life, because it's one of the most comforting things of all. When you face adversity, you face adversity, you face difficulty, you face opposition, you face failure, but you can continue to say, I'm doing what I was put here to do. That's a fantastic feeling. And Weber says that is at the core, I think, of modern morale. But we have to generate that feeling in the absence of divine certainty or divine validation or divine hope.
Now, one of the most moving chapters in your book was the chapter on the consolation of witness. And I might open up the idea here and get you to explain it, but you talk about Anna Akhmatov, I believe her name was, and you talk about Primo Levi, and you talk about the horrors that these people saw and went through, and the consolation that they found, looking towards us in a way, looking towards us as in the future. And we became their consolation, that they were just desperate to make sure that the truth of what happened was what was remembered.
Yeah, I think this is a reading of these folks that's important. Present, past, and future are deeply tied together. One of the themes running through the whole book is the sense that if there is consolation in a secular world, it's in the continuity of human experience. The fact that, in the present, you may be forgotten, or your work may be forgotten, but someone down the road, up ahead, will remember what you did or find something you said useful. And so this sense that we can be consoled by the future is a very important aspect of human experience, and particularly poignantly expressed by people like the great Russian poet Anna Akhmatova, who witnessed the worst crimes of Stalinism, and Primo Levi, who survived to write about Auschwitz. What kept them going in the middle of these horrible experiences, was the belief that if they recorded what they saw, what they felt, what they endured, that this record would be passed on to the future. And even if they didn't make it through the record of what they had suffered and experienced and understood would be preserved by the future, so that I was born after the war, we are essentially their consolation. Primo Levi got through the horrendous experience of Auschwitz, believing that if he recorded what happened, that we, the generations who came after, would be, as it were, his consolation. And what makes the Primo Levi story so troubling is that in 1987, after a heroic lifetime of writing these incredible books about Auschwitz and the meaning of it, he appears to have committed suicide at the end of his life. Now, and it is possible that he committed suicide in part because he was depressed that, we had let him down. That is, that succeeding generations had not paid attention to his active witness. It may be also that he simply took his life or ended his life for other reasons that had to do with private griefs. But it is a haunting possibility that we betrayed him, that we let him down. And so this raises a very important issue about consolation. I wrote the book basically to say that we're never alone. The human experience goes back right to Job and even behind that. And we can derive enormous consolation from just connecting to these incredible works of human struggle and effort. But we, in turn, have a responsibility to the future to hand to the next generation our witness, our understanding, our knowledge, our forms of consolation. And we do so in the hope that we will be remembered, or our wisdom will not be forgotten. And that's the human gamble. That's what we're all trying to hope will be true. And in the Levi case, it raises the difficult question of whether he felt that we had been his consolation or not.
So let's finish things off with, in the last 10 minutes or so here, with a few questions about the last chapter in your book, and it's appropriate that we end here. And this is the chapter about Cicely Saunders and the hospice. And this is one of the chapters where you really bring home about the importance of truth for consolation. And she brings back, as you write it, the institutional setting for consolation. And she talks in very clear ways about how you have to have a clear eye on things. And she knew that the doctors around had their own fears. And she understood that many of them couldn't tell the patients the truth because they couldn't tell themselves the truth in many ways. And that instead of dying, as you mentioned just before, that dying being this loneliest moment in our lives that we like to imagine, it's not that at all. It's actually one of the most public and social moments that we're ever going to have. So let's go to Cicely Saunders and that shift she tries to make.
No. Most of the book is about philosophers and writers and artists. And Cicely Saunders was a doctor and a nurse. And what makes her so unique in her contribution was that she understood that consolation was a social practice. It required a place and it required a time. And so she revived a medieval institution, the hospice, and invented the modern practice of palliative care with a lot of other people, by the way. And I think did more to change how we die than almost anybody I can think of, because, and this is my point, she understood that consolation is central to the process of dying. We want to be consoled as we die. That is, we want to be comforted. We want to have the fear of it taken away. But we also want to be consoled about the shape of our life. We want to feel that it wasn't just one damn thing after another, a kind of pointless excursion. We want to have a sense that our life had some purpose to it. And part of the anguish of dying, Cicely Saunders understood, was was the sense that we couldn't make sense of our lives. It wasn't just that we were afraid of dying. We were afraid of our own lives. We were afraid that our lives didn't make any sense. And so what she proposed is that we needed a place where we could make peace with our lives and make peace with our dying, and in turn then make peace with those around us. This is the point about the social character of dying. And she makes one point that I think, of all the things I read to think about this book, I think being with Cicely Saunders, one of the things I learned was she made me rethink who death is for. It's an odd question. We often think that death is just simply our death. And she urges us to think that we die for others. That is, in the moment of our dying or in the process of our dying, it is a performance that occurs in the presence of our loved ones or the people we care about. And one of the things we can do for them, if we've got the peace of mind and we are consoled, we can console them. We can take the fear of dying away from those we love by showing that you can die calmly, quietly, at peace with yourself and at peace with your life. And so there's a purpose to dying that I had never really seen. I just thought of dying as the end of my life. But she's saying, no, it's not the end of your life. You have an opportunity, if you can control the pain and you can control the fear and you can make peace with your loved ones, to show them the very simple thing. This is not such a bad thing. It's not such a bad way to go. And that's, to me at least, an extraordinarily positive image of dying, a deeply consoling one. It gives me a sense there's something I can do. Do you know what I mean? There's something I can help with. And so that's why the book ends with her. And I think of all the people I spent time with writing this book, spending time with Cicely Saunders was, in its quiet way, one of the most revealing.
Well, it doesn't quite end with her. It ends with you. And it ends with you in incredibly interesting ways and incredibly courageous ways, if I might say so. You write, I wish my parents could have had a good death and that their death left great scars upon you. And I remember years ago reading you write this. Now, both of my parents are alive, and I know when they die, it's gonna destroy me in so many ways. And I read this of yours years ago, and I remember thinking that's exactly what it's going to feel like. And you wrote, they had been the audience of my life, and then suddenly the theater was empty. And it seemed such a clear way to understand such a impossible to understand loss. So as a last question, please take us there. And also with this line where you end the book, you say, consolation is the most arduous, but also the most rewarding work that we'll ever do.
Yeah, I think the book is a reflection on what it was like to lose my mom and dad. It was a blow because I loved them and they loved me. I think some of it's very simple, and the regret I feel is that I wasn't there when my dad died, and so I feel he had to die alone, and that seems like a terrible thing. And my mom died in a hospital in a setting that was just, it's a clattering, noisy, indifferent. There was something, she wasn't honored the way she should have been. So, and I've taken a while to be consoled for that. And I think that that's what taught me how much of consolation is an unconscious process in which you somehow mysteriously you heal yourself and you're healed by others and by other people's love. And I certainly think other people's love has certainly helped me to kind of get over my parents' death. And I now look back on my parents with kind of pretty uncomplicated affection and gratitude. But grief can be just brutal and it creates a kind of despair that you have to struggle with. And I think I want to resurrect or restore this notion of consolation. It's a religious idea, and it's kind of, in a way, dropped out of the language. And people often ask me, why are you writing a book about consolation? It's because it is just unavoidable, essential work. The death of your parents goes with the territory. That's what happens. Your parents die before you. And as I said, you're suddenly in a theater where the two seats that you care about are empty. And you think, what the hell is this play for if they're not there to watch it? And so this is just, it's the most human, ordinary, and banal experience that we all go through. And if we go through it and we have no choice but to go through it, then we better think about the process by which we get better, by which we recover, by which we find words to explain and bear and understand what happens. And that it's not just the death of parents, it's failure. I mean, half of the time we fail at what we do. And you have to figure out how you get back on the horse, how you begin to think of yourself positively after having failed at something that you wanted to succeed at. And these are just built into the humble reality of everybody's life. And that's why consolation and trying to find words, trying to find meanings for our experience is just an essential element of the human experience, which I kind of wanted to bring back into the conversation by looking at all of these sublime, fantastic people who managed to do it. The book, I hope, is very hopeful because it shows that we are the heirs of a fantastic tradition of wisdom, and we need to use it.
Did writing the book personally bring you any personal consolation?
Oh, I think so, Jed. I think there's no question. I don't think I've ever been happier in my life than writing parts of this book. I can't explain why. I just felt the power of these works kind of surging through me, and I love doing it. And I hope that other people reading the book will feel some of the pleasure, some of the excitement, some of the consolation that I felt.
Well, I felt it, and I'm sure readers will as well. The book is called On Consolation, which will be linked below the podcast. And I really cannot encourage listeners enough to go and read it for themselves. On that, Michael Ignatieff, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure, Jed. It was a very good conversation. I love talking to you, and I wish you all the best personally.